They've opened the tomb of Richard III, they've examined medieval kings, they've even unwrapped ancient pharaohs and run their DNA. But there's one royal coffin that's been sealed for over 400 years, and every single request to open it gets denied. What did they discover when Elizabeth II died that the British establishment is still protecting today? When researchers in 2012 wanted to dig up a medieval king, the British establishment said yes. When they wanted to unwrap ancient mummies and sequence their DNA, permission granted. When universities requested to examine Henry VII's remains, the tomb was opened without hesitation. But when anyone asks to examine Elizabeth I's body, the answer is always the same. Denied! The pattern isn't random, and it isn't about respect. They've opened dozens of royal tombs across Westminster Abbey for historical research. But Elizabeth's coffin has remained sealed for over 4 centuries. In 1952, during the coronation of Elizabeth II, historians submitted a formal petition with compelling academic justification. Rejected. In 1975, when non-invasive scanning technology became available that could examine the coffin without ever opening it, they tried again. Rejected. In 2003, on the 400th anniversary of her death, prestigious universities offered to use state-of-the-art preservation techniques with absolute discretion. Rejected again. The official explanation is always the same hollow phrase about respecting the dead, but that excuse crumbles when you realize they've disturbed every other monarch without such concerns. They dug Richard III out from under a parking lot and subjected his skeleton to comprehensive DNA analysis, CT scans, and facial reconstruction. They've examined medieval kings, opened ancient crypts, and studied remains that were far older and supposedly more sacred than Elizabeth's. The vault where Elizabeth lies isn't some inaccessible archaeological site buried under centuries of construction. It's a mapped location in Westminster Abbey's Lady Chapel, sharing space with her half-sister Mary I. The coffin is right there, documented, catalogued, and completely accessible if the establishment wanted to grant permission. Modern technology could answer every question without disturbing a single bone. Ground-penetrating radar could map the coffin's contents. Advanced imaging could see through the lead casing. DNA analysis from a tiny sample could reveal biological truths that have been hidden for 400 years. But the gatekeepers of British history refuse every request, and they've been refusing for generations. When you examine the pattern of denials, something becomes clear. This isn't about preserving dignity or honoring tradition. The British establishment is protecting something specific about Elizabeth I, something they believe would be catastrophic if revealed. They're not protecting her legacy or her memory. They're protecting a secret that was sealed into that coffin in 1603 and has been guarded ever since. The question isn't whether they're hiding something. The evidence makes that undeniable. The question is what they discovered when they prepared her body for burial, and why that discovery has been considered too dangerous to confirm for over 4 centuries. The answer might lie in those final hours after Elizabeth died, when something happened behind locked doors that changed everything. The speed of what followed should have raised immediate suspicion, but in the chaos of royal succession, nobody dared ask questions. Within hours of her death, not days, her corpse was wrapped in treated cloth and sealed inside a lead coffin that was soldered shut before anyone outside her innermost circle could examine what lay beneath the elaborate costumes. Lead coffins were standard for royalty, serving both symbolic and practical purposes in an era without modern preservation techniques. But the timing was unprecedented. Royal bodies typically lay in state for days, sometimes weeks, allowing nobles, clergy, and physicians to pay respects and document the monarch's passing for historical records. Elizabeth's body was sealed so fast that rigor mortis hadn't fully set in, the muscles still soft, the joints still flexible. The handful of servants present during the preparation were immediately scattered across England, like dandelion seeds in the wind. Sent to remote estates with generous pensions and terrifying explicit threats about what would happen if they ever spoke about what they witnessed in that death chamber. High-ranking nobles who had every right to witness the preparation of a queen's body found themselves turned away by guards who had explicit orders from the Privy Council. These weren't minor courtiers, but powerful men who had served Elizabeth for decades, men who should have been present to verify the proper treatment of their monarch's remains. They were refused entry without explanation, without apology, without the courtesy their rank demanded. Even more disturbing were the physicians. The doctors who had attended Elizabeth's final illness, men who had examined her countless times over the years and knew her medical history intimately, found themselves mysteriously excluded from the death chamber. They should have been the first people called to document the cause of death, to provide medical testimony for the official records. Instead, they were kept away from her body as if their knowledge was dangerous. 3 of those physicians died within a year of Elizabeth's passing under circumstances that were never properly explained. One was listed as dying from sudden fever, a diagnosis so vague it meant absolutely nothing in an era when fever could describe any elevated temperature. Another fell downstairs and broke his neck, a convenient accident that closed all inquiry. The third suffered what records called apoplexy, another catch-all term that explained nothing and ended all questions. These weren't elderly men at the end of their natural lives who might be expected to die from age-related causes. They were experienced physicians in the prime of their careers, respected medical professionals who should have had decades of practice ahead of them. The statistical probability of 3 doctors who all treated the same patient dying within 12 months of her death is astronomically small. 1 death could be coincidence. 2 deaths strain credibility. 3 deaths constitute a pattern, and that pattern suggests someone was systematically eliminating witnesses who might have seen something they shouldn't have. But the most chilling detail isn't the death themselves. It's what happened to their records. Every physician in that era kept detailed medical notes, documenting symptoms, treatments, and observations for future reference and professional consultation. These notes were valuable professional assets, often bequeathed to younger doctors or donated to medical colleges. Yet the records of all 3 physicians who treated Elizabeth's final illness vanished completely. No medical notes, no personal journals, no letters discussing her case with colleagues. Everything that might have documented what they observed about the Queen's true physical condition was gone, as if someone had methodically hunted down every piece of evidence and destroyed it. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. Someone with considerable power and resources was cleaning up, removing anyone who might speak and destroying anything that might provide proof. But the cover-up didn't begin with Elizabeth's death. It had been carefully maintained throughout her entire reign, a 45-year performance that required constant vigilance and absolute control over who could get close enough to discover the truth. Foreign ambassadors who visited the English court sent back reports that are startling in their consistency and their confusion. These weren't casual observers with untrained eyes. They were highly trained diplomatic spies, whose job was to assess royalty with professional precision for their governments. They had observed hundreds of queens and princesses across every court in Europe. They knew exactly what royal women looked like, how they moved, how they carried themselves, how they spoke. Elizabeth baffled every single one of them. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Elizabeth possessed what he specifically described as an unusually loud voice and a masculine manner of speaking. In an era when women were expected to speak softly and deferentially, Elizabeth's voice carried across rooms with a projection and authority that seemed wrong for her gender. Another diplomat noted with evident confusion that she had more the bearing of a soldier than a lady, moving with long strides and confident posture that violated every expectation of feminine deportment. The most disturbing report came from a Spanish envoy who was immediately recalled to Madrid after sending an encrypted dispatch that contained one devastating sentence about the English Queen. He wrote that Her Majesty's form is not as other women's. That's all he said. 7 words that ended his diplomatic career because he was pulled out of England within days and never given the chance to elaborate on what he meant by that cryptic observation. The Spanish government clearly understood the implication and considered the information so sensitive that the diplomat had to be removed immediately before he could provide more details. But the physical observations went far beyond diplomatic confusion. Elizabeth's own tutor, Roger Ascham, who educated her from childhood and knew her better than almost anyone outside her immediate household, wrote something revealing in his private correspondence. He noted that her mind has no womanly weakness, and her perseverance is equal to that of a man. In the 16th century, this wasn't meant as a compliment to a brilliant woman's intelligence. It was a confused observation from an educator who expected female students to think and learn in certain ways, to show certain limitations that were considered naturally feminine. Elizabeth consistently broke those patterns in ways that troubled even those who loved her. She mastered Latin, Greek, and multiple modern languages with a speed that amazed teachers who had educated male scholars. She could debate theology with bishops and outmaneuver counselors twice her age in political discussions, showing a grasp of complex strategy that seemed to come naturally rather than through study. Her physical stamina was legendary and deeply unusual for women of her era. She would hunt for hours, outlasting men half her age in pursuits that required sustained physical exertion. She could ride for entire days without showing fatigue, maintaining pace with soldiers and courtiers who prided themselves on their endurance. Ambassadors noted her unusually large and powerful hands for a woman, hands that looked like they belonged on a swordsman rather than a queen. They commented on her stride, which was long and confident, rather than the mincing steps that were drilled into noble ladies from childhood. Most strikingly, Elizabeth was exceptionally tall for her era. In a time when the average woman stood around 5 feet tall, Elizabeth towered over other women and matched the height of many male courtiers. All of these characteristics individually might be explained away as genetic variation or unusual development. But taken together, layer upon layer of observations from dozens of independent sources, they paint a picture that made contemporary observers deeply uncomfortable, even if they couldn't articulate why. Everything about Elizabeth's appearance was artificial, controlled, and deliberately concealing in ways that went far beyond the vanity of a powerful woman. From her 20s onward, she wore increasingly elaborate wigs that completely covered her natural hair, towering constructions decorated with jewels and pearls that added nearly a foot to her height. The official explanation was that she suffered from hair loss due to smallpox in 1562, but some historians question whether she ever had smallpox at all. The supposed illness was never witnessed by many people. The scarring that should have been visible on her face was never documented by the ambassadors who examined her appearance so carefully, and the diagnosis seemed conveniently timed to begin a lifetime of wearing wigs. What was she hiding beneath those elaborate constructions? A hairline that was receding in a naturally masculine pattern? Hair growth that didn't match feminine expectations? The wigs became more extreme as she aged, growing larger and more elaborate until they were architectural marvels that must have been physically exhausting to wear. The heavy white makeup that became her trademark was supposedly to achieve the pale complexion that Tudor beauty standards demanded. But Elizabeth took it to extremes that literally poisoned her. She painted her face with Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar that created a flawless porcelain mask, but also slowly destroyed her skin and poisoned her bloodstream with toxic metals. By the end of her life, her face was so damaged by decades of lead-based cosmetics that witnesses said the makeup was melting off, literally peeling away in sheets and taking skin with it. The damage was so severe that she could no longer maintain the illusion, and in her final months, she reportedly stopped wearing the makeup altogether, telling her horrified ladies that she was past caring what people saw. Why would anyone subject themselves to decades of poisoning, knowing the cosmetics were destroying their face, unless they were hiding something beneath that mask that was more dangerous to reveal than the damage from the chemicals? And the clothing. Elizabeth wore the highest collars, the most elaborate ruffs, the most concealing gowns of any monarch in history. Her dresses had structured bodices that created an artificial silhouette, using whalebone and padding to shape her body into an expected feminine form. She never appeared in public without multiple layers of clothing that made it impossible to see her true shape, her natural proportions, the reality beneath the costume. Even in private, even in summer heat, she maintained the layers and the structure. When they finally removed those clothes after her death, they discovered deep, permanent grooves across her entire torso, where the boning had pressed into her flesh for decades, some cuts so deep they had never healed properly. But here's the question that historians have wrestled with since the day Elizabeth took the throne in 1558. Why didn't she marry? This wasn't a minor political preference or a personal choice that affected only her private life. This was the single most important political decision facing the English monarchy, and Elizabeth refused to make it for 44 years despite relentless pressure from every direction imaginable. Her own Privy Council begged her constantly to choose a husband, presenting memoranda and formal petitions year after year. William Cecil, her closest and most trusted advisor, the man who served her faithfully for her entire reign, wrote desperate pleas urging her to marry before it was too late for children. Parliament formally petitioned her multiple times to select a consort and produce an heir, making it clear that the future of England depended on her decision. Foreign kings and princes from every major power in Europe proposed marriage, offering alliances that could have reshaped the political landscape for generations. Philip II of Spain, one of the most powerful monarchs in the world, offered himself as a husband. The Archduke Charles of Austria pursued her for years through diplomatic channels. The Duke of Anjou came to England and courted her personally, spending months at the English court in elaborate negotiations. Swedish, Danish, and German princes all sent representatives hoping to negotiate a match that would bind their nations to England through royal marriage. Elizabeth was the most eligible woman in the entire world, a young queen with an entire kingdom as her dowry, and her marriage could have formed an alliance that would have shaped European politics for generations. Yet she refused them all, one after another, year after year, until the proposals finally stopped coming, and everyone realized she would never choose. She always had excuses that sounded reasonable on the surface. The timing wasn't right for this particular candidate. That suitor had diplomatic complications that needed to be resolved first. She needed more time to consider England's interests before making such a momentous decision. She would decide soon, always soon, never now. The political stakes of her refusal couldn't have been higher, and Elizabeth understood exactly what she was risking. England's entire future depended on a clear succession. Elizabeth had no siblings who could inherit after her death. Her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, had a claim to the throne, but Mary was Catholic and represented everything the Protestant Reformation had fought against. If Elizabeth died without a clear heir, England would descend into civil war with Catholics rallying behind one claimant and Protestants behind another. Foreign powers would invade to support whichever faction served their interests, and the kingdom would be torn apart. Elizabeth knew all this because she was brilliant at political calculation, always thinking several moves ahead like a chess grandmaster. She understood that her refusal to marry was potentially dooming England to chaos after her death. Yet she still refused year after year. Historians have proposed numerous explanations over the centuries, theories that try to make sense of her inexplicable decision. Some argue she was psychologically traumatized by watching her father Henry VIII cycle through 6 wives, 2 of them beheaded, creating a fear of marriage that overrode political necessity. Some suggest she was playing an elaborate diplomatic game, using the perpetual possibility of marriage as a bargaining chip to manipulate foreign powers and keep multiple nations competing for England's alliance. Some believe she genuinely preferred political independence to the subordination that marriage would have brought, valuing her power too much to share it with a husband. But there's another explanation that fits the evidence perfectly and explains why no amount of pressure could change her decision. What if Elizabeth physically couldn't marry because any husband would have discovered her secret on the wedding night? What if the celebrated Virgin Queen wasn't choosing virginity at all, but desperately hiding a biological reality that would have destroyed everything? In 1559, less than a year into Elizabeth's reign when she was only 25 years old, something extraordinary happened that should have been impossible. The Count de Feria, a senior advisor to King Philip II of Spain, wrote an encrypted dispatch that was so sensitive it was hidden in Spanish archives for centuries. In that letter, he stated something that demonstrated Spain's intelligence network had penetrated deep into the English court. He wrote that if his spies do not lie, which he believed they do not, for a certain reason which they have recently given him, he understood she will not bear children. Read that phrasing carefully because every word matters. Less than a year into her reign, before she had rejected any major marriage proposals, before anyone could have known her intentions through her political decisions, Spanish intelligence had somehow determined that Elizabeth was incapable of bearing children. Not that she wouldn't marry, not that she was choosing a political path that avoided motherhood, but that she could not physically bear children. How did they know this with such certainty? What certain reason had their spies discovered that allowed them to report this as established fact rather than speculation? The phrasing suggests they had obtained concrete information, not rumor or assumption, about Elizabeth's physical condition that made childbearing biologically impossible. Spanish intelligence was the best in Europe, with agents embedded throughout the English court at every level, who reported everything they observed back to Madrid. They had somehow learned something specific about Elizabeth's body, some medical reality that made pregnancy impossible, and they knew it with enough certainty to report it to the Spanish king as fact. This wasn't gossip about her being too old or politically unwilling to marry. She was 25 years old in the prime of childbearing years, and the report explicitly states a physical impossibility. The Count's letter raises a terrifying question that opens up the entire conspiracy. How many people at the English court actually knew the truth? Clearly, Spanish spies had discovered something concrete enough to report to Madrid with confidence, which means someone in Elizabeth's inner circle either knew her secret or had observed something during medical care or private moments that revealed it. Were there courtiers who suspected but kept silent out of loyalty or fear? Ladies-in-waiting who had seen too much during intimate moments of dressing or bathing? Physicians who had examined her and been sworn to silence with their lives as collateral? The evidence suggests that Elizabeth lived in constant fear of discovery, taking extreme measures to control who had access to her body in any capacity. She limited her physicians to a tiny circle of trusted doctors who had served her since childhood. Men whose loyalty had been tested over years and who understood that any betrayal would mean execution. When she fell seriously ill in 1566, an illness so severe that everyone believed she was dying, and counselors were already preparing for civil war over the succession, her doctors begged for permission to examine her properly. Elizabeth initially refused, even though her life was clearly at stake. choosing to risk death rather than allow a thorough physical examination. The political situation became so desperate with the kingdom on the verge of collapse that she finally granted permission for her personal physician, Dr. Hugh, to conduct a comprehensive examination. What happened in that examination room has haunted historians ever since because the aftermath suggests he discovered something that shook him to his core. When Dr. Hugh emerged after nearly an hour alone with the Queen, witnesses reported that his face had gone completely pale, drained of color as if he'd seen something that horrified him. He looked deeply troubled, disturbed in a way that went beyond normal medical concern for a sick patient, and his hands were trembling. He refused to discuss what he had discovered beyond prescribing immediate treatment for her illness, avoiding all questions from concerned courtiers about the Queen's condition. After that examination, Dr. Hugh became a different person in ways that everyone around him noticed. He withdrew from court life, stopped attending social functions and celebrations that he had previously enjoyed, and avoided conversations with medical colleagues who wanted to discuss interesting cases. When other physicians tried to consult with him about the Queen's ongoing health issues, seeking his expertise as her personal doctor, he would change the subject abruptly or simply walk away without explanation. Whatever he had seen during that examination affected him so profoundly that he couldn't speak about it, couldn't process it normally, couldn't maintain his previous relationships with professional peers who would naturally ask questions. A year later, Dr. Hugh was dead. The official cause recorded in death registers was sudden fever, that conveniently vague diagnosis that explained nothing and ended all inquiry. His medical notes and personal papers, the detailed records that every physician kept throughout their career, were never found. If he had written anything about what he observed during that examination, anything that might explain his shocked reaction or document the medical reality he discovered, it vanished completely, as if someone had systematically hunted down every scrap of evidence and destroyed it. Elizabeth's relationship with Robert Dudley provides perhaps the most tragic and compelling evidence that she was hiding something that made marriage physically impossible rather than politically undesirable. Dudley was the obvious love of her life, and their connection was so apparent that everyone who spent time at the English court could see it spanning over 30 years of devotion. They had known each other since childhood, both imprisoned in the Tower of London during the reign of Mary I, both facing possible execution for Protestant sympathies, both sharing that crucible of terror that creates bonds nothing else can match. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, one of her very first acts was to appoint Dudley as Master of the Horse, a position that required him to be constantly at her side, attending to her transportation and accompanying her everywhere. They rode together every morning before the court woke, danced together at every celebration, and shared private moments that scandalized foreign ambassadors who reported their suspicions back to their governments. The Spanish ambassador claimed in encrypted dispatches that Elizabeth visited Dudley's private chambers at night, implying a sexual relationship that would have been shocking for an unmarried queen. English courtiers gossiped endlessly about what they witnessed, with some believing they were already secretly married while others thought they were lovers, waiting for the right moment to formalize their relationship. Here's what makes this relationship so important to understanding Elizabeth's secret. She had absolute power to marry Robert Dudley anytime she wanted without anyone's permission. She was the Queen of England, answerable to no authority on earth, holding power that was considered divinely ordained. Her council would have protested such a marriage to a mere earl, but she could have overruled them with a single command. Parliament would have complained about the political implications, but she could have ignored them completely. She had the authority, the power, and the obvious desire. She was deeply, visibly in love with this man for over 30 years. Yet she never married him despite 3 decades of constant companionship. Despite love that everyone could see, despite having the power to do whatever she wanted, the conventional explanation focuses on the suspicious death of Dudley's first wife, Amy Robsart, in 1560. Amy was found dead at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck, and rumors immediately exploded that Dudley had arranged her murder to free himself for the Queen. The scandal was intense, and historians have long argued that Elizabeth couldn't marry Dudley afterward without appearing complicit in murder, destroying her political credibility. But this explanation has serious problems when you examine the timeline and Elizabeth's actual political power. Amy's death was investigated by a coroner's jury and officially ruled an accident after examining all the evidence. The scandal, while initially intense and threatening to Elizabeth's reputation, faded within a few years as other news captured public attention and new crises demanded focus. Elizabeth could have married Dudley in 1565 or 1570 or 1575 or 1580, or any time over the next 3 decades after the scandal had subsided and most people had moved on to other concerns. She had countless opportunities after public memory of Amy's death had faded, but she never took them. Something else prevented the marriage, something permanent that couldn't be overcome by waiting for scandal to blow over or for political circumstances to change. Late in his life, Dudley wrote something in a letter that has puzzled historians for centuries. The letter was subsequently destroyed, but its contents were recorded by people who read it before the destruction. He referred to a secret that bound him and Elizabeth together, a secret he wrote about with evident pain and sorrow. This secret, he stated, was a source of sorrow rather than joy, a burden they both carried that prevented the happiness they desired. What secret could create such pain between two people who clearly loved each other deeply and wanted to be together? The most logical explanation is devastating in its simplicity and tragedy. Dudley knew. He had discovered Elizabeth's true nature, whether through accident, through intimate moments that revealed what others never saw, or through direct confession when she could no longer maintain the deception with the man she loved. And he was bound by that knowledge, trapped by a truth he could never speak. He couldn't marry her because he understood why marriage was impossible, not because of politics or scandal or timing, but because of biological reality that neither of them could change. Think about the profound tragedy of that situation for both of them. Two people deeply in love, spending decades together in constant companionship, sharing private moments and public triumphs, yet unable to formalize their relationship or build the life together they both wanted. Dudley died in 1588, and Elizabeth was reportedly inconsolable with grief that went beyond a normal mourning. She locked herself in her chambers for days, refusing to eat or speak to anyone, and had to be forcibly removed by her counselors, who were genuinely worried about her mental state and her ability to continue governing. She kept his last letter to her in a box beside her bed for the remaining 15 years of her life, never letting it out of her sight. On the envelope, she had written in her own hand his last letter, marking it as precious beyond measure. The depth of their connection, the pain of their enforced separation, the secret they shared that could never be spoken, all suggests a relationship that went far beyond politics or conventional romance. They were bound together by knowledge that could never be revealed, a truth that explained why the most powerful woman in England couldn't marry the man she loved, even though nothing political or legal prevented it. And when Elizabeth's own death approached in 1603, she took extraordinary measures to ensure that truth would die with her, sealed in a coffin that has never been opened since. By early 1603, everyone at the English court could see that death was approaching for Elizabeth I. She was 69 years old, ancient by the standards of her era, when most people died in their 50s, and failing in ways she could no longer hide behind makeup and costume. The famous energy that had sustained her for 4 decades was gone, replaced by exhaustion that was visible to everyone. She moved slowly, tired quickly, and the sharp wit that had terrified courtiers and delighted ambassadors seemed to come and go unpredictably. Most dramatically, she stopped wearing the elaborate makeup that had been her mask for 45 years. The white Venetian cerris that had hidden her features and slowly poisoned her was abandoned, and she told her horrified ladies that she was past caring what people saw when they looked at her. As her body shut down, Elizabeth's behavior became increasingly strange in ways that troubled everyone around her. She stopped eating almost entirely, managing only occasional sips of broth, because swallowing had become agonizing. Her abdomen began swelling grotesquely over the final weeks, expanding until she appeared several months pregnant in a cruel irony that wasn't lost on anyone. The Virgin Queen, who had spent her entire life refusing motherhood and denying her body's capabilities, now looked pregnant as she approached death. The swelling was almost certainly fluid accumulation from organ failure, but the symbolism haunted everyone who witnessed it. Then came the strangest behavior that no one could explain. Elizabeth refused to go to bed for nearly 2 weeks, absolutely refused to lie down, despite desperate pleas from everyone around her. Her doctors begged her to rest properly to preserve what little strength remained. Her counselors implored her to be reasonable and care for herself. Her ladies tried every argument they could think of, but she rejected them all with increasing agitation. She sat in chairs, propped herself against cushions piled on the floor, and let her attendants hold her upright when she couldn't manage on her own. But she would not get in that bed no matter what anyone said. When asked why she was being so stubborn, Elizabeth gave different answers that were increasingly incoherent. "Once I lie in that bed," she said, "I shall never rise again." Another time she insisted that the bed is a trap, that death waits there for her. Sometimes she just shook her head violently and refused to speak about it at all, becoming agitated if anyone pressed the issue. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth Tudor stopped breathing, and the moment she died, her counselors moved with extraordinary speed as if they had been preparing for this exact moment for a very long time. The doors to her chamber were locked immediately with guards posted outside who had strict orders that absolutely no one could enter or leave without explicit permission from the Privy Council. Only the most trusted ladies-in-waiting were allowed to remain inside to prepare the body, women who had served Elizabeth for decades and whose loyalty was absolutely certain. Even high-ranking nobles who should have had automatic access to witness a queen's death were removed without explanation, escorted out by guards who refused to answer any questions. The preparation of Elizabeth's body happened behind those locked doors with only a handful of witnesses, all of whom were given explicit and terrifying instructions before they were allowed to participate. Speak of nothing you see. Nothing. They began undressing the queen's corpse, removing the elaborate layers that had hidden her body for 44 years. First the jeweled gown, then the multiple petticoats, then the structural corset that had created an artificial silhouette, each layer revealing more of what Elizabeth had spent a lifetime concealing. When they removed the white makeup that had become part of her face, witnesses reported that it came away in sheets, literally peeling off and taking skin with it. Decades of lead-based cosmetics had eaten through her flesh like acid, creating wounds that looked like burns. One lady-in-waiting vomited at the sight and was immediately escorted out and sent away to a remote estate, with instructions never to speak of what she had witnessed. They removed the corset that had been laced tightly for so many years that it was practically embedded in her body, the fabric and boning pressed into flesh for decades. When they cut it away, they discovered deep, permanent grooves across her entire torso, where the bones had pressed into her flesh. Some cut so deep they looked like they might have reached internal organs. Her ribs were visibly misshapen, some cracked and healed improperly from constant pressure over decades. But these horrors, as disturbing as they were, could be explained by Tudor fashion and toxic cosmetics that wealthy women used despite knowing the dangers. What they discovered beneath the final layers of clothing was something else entirely, something that the surviving accounts describe only in vague euphemisms and coded language as fundamentally wrong. Something was not as it should be, either absent when it should have been present or present when it should have been absent. And that brings us to why King James I, the man who had every reason to destroy Elizabeth's reputation, instead became her most zealous protector. James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had kept imprisoned for 19 years before finally ordering her execution in 1587. He should have hated Elizabeth for what she did to his mother. When he inherited the English throne after Elizabeth's death, he had the perfect opportunity to diminish her legacy, to allow examinations that might reveal embarrassing truths, to let history judge her harshly. Instead, James did the opposite. He spent over £11,000 on Elizabeth's lavish funeral, an enormous sum that demonstrated respect rather than contempt. He commissioned a magnificent white marble tomb for her remains, ordering it to be placed in the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey. And most tellingly, he issued explicit orders that her remains were never to be disturbed, never examined, never moved under any circumstances. Why would he protect the reputation of a woman who had killed his mother unless he knew that opening that tomb would reveal something catastrophic? Unless someone had told him what was discovered when they undressed the Queen's corpse, showing him evidence that made him understand why the secret had to be protected. The British establishment has maintained that protection ever since for over 4 centuries. Every request to examine Elizabeth's remains has been denied regardless of the scientific advancement offered, the academic credentials of those requesting, or the promises of discretion made. They claim it's about respect for the dead, but that excuse is hollow when they've opened every other royal tomb without such concerns. Modern technology could answer every question without disturbing her remains. Ground-penetrating radar could map the coffin's contents. Advanced imaging could see through the lead casing. DNA testing from a tiny sample could reveal biological truths that have been hidden for 400 years. But they refuse every request as if they're protecting something more important than historical knowledge or scientific advancement. What makes Elizabeth I so different from every other monarch? What are they still protecting after 4 centuries of silence? The answer might be that England's greatest monarch, the Virgin Queen who defined an era and made England a world power, was living as the wrong gender. Whether born female with an intersex condition, or replaced by a boy in the village of Bisley as local legend claims, the person who ruled was extraordinary regardless of biology. But if that coffin was ever opened, if DNA tests were ever run, If the truth was finally revealed, it would rewrite everything we know about one of history's most famous figures. And that's a truth the establishment has decided the world still isn't ready to know. If this investigation into one of history's deepest mysteries has you questioning everything you thought you knew, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now, because we're just getting started. We're uncovering the secrets that powerful institutions have spent centuries hiding, the conspiracies that changed the world, and the truths that challenge everything in our history books. Hit that like button if you believe it's finally time for Westminster Abbey to let science examine that coffin after 400 years of denial, and drop your theory in the comments below. Do you think Elizabeth was hiding a biological secret that would have destroyed her reign? Was she replaced by the Bisley Boy? Or is there another explanation we haven't considered? Your insights could reveal something historians have missed for centuries, because sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look. The establishment has kept this secret long enough. Let's uncover it together.